Richard Jenkins is our final presenter in this economics section, and he is a co-founder of Plan One, project management consultancy. He's also the host of a podcast called Yada Yada, and he's going to talk to us about a really successful project he worked on during the pandemic and the impact it has had in a retail and commercial centre post-pandemic as well. So there'll be some great lessons. So I hand over to you, Richard. You're on mute. There we go. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Bronwyn. And thank you for the opportunity to be as part of this symposium. I'm really enjoying the speakers to date. And I think there's a lot of synergies across a lot of the speakers so far. So hopefully it is all working from my end. I've had a few technical difficulties, but we've got there in the end. So thank you for your patience. As Bronwyn said, we were part of a piece of work engaged by the City of Melbourne that was also received funding from the state, and essentially to reimagine and reactivate the CBD in the midst of the COVID pandemic. What I'd like to share with you today is just some of the strategies that we looked at in that program, but also how we're also helping a number of councils around Australia as they are learning to, I suppose, deal with a post-pandemic environment now. And certainly there's some good things and bad things that have come out of it, but I think there are some opportunities for all of us to learn. So what I suppose I'd like to start off with is that these three photos on my screen right now are Melbourne CBD, New York, and Acland Street in St Kilda, Melbourne, or Victoria. And the first two shots on the left are obviously, or in the midst of the pandemic. So there's not a lot of people around, significant lot of vacancies and businesses falling behind. Acland Street photo was actually just taken about a month ago. So the impact of the pandemic is still being felt. It's not just COVID, but what I'd like to say is that there's a structural change that has occurred. And we need to be cognizant of that. At Plan One, we have a range of services, but we look at all property sectors, and I think that's increasingly important today. It's not just a one solution. Everything has to work holistically. We've heard from a number of our speakers of the different opportunities where we're seeing growth from supply chain. Commuters have now changed their patterns of working. We're seeing a more dispersed workforce. So what we need to see from the solutions of economies and local communities is something different from what it was 5 years ago. Highlighting, I suppose, just focusing on the pandemic, and I don't want to relive this too often, we've been through it enough. However, it's nothing to really surprise that Melbourne was the greatest, expensive, greatest lockdown days of anywhere globally, and certainly in Australia. And that has had long-lasting effects, particularly in Melbourne, but we're seeing those changes being still borne out globally. If we looked at the impact of particular property sectors, and this is just looking at the CBD, and I'll refer why we're looking at the CBD when we're looking at the growth areas of the community. But you can see the vacancy rate of the CBD office is actually still increasing in Melbourne. Its latest is at almost at 15%, and it's probably likely to increase to 20% in years to come. CBD retail, while it peaked at 35% in COVID, it's now back down to about 10%. And while that is an improvement, it's well above its long-term history of 3%. Whereas residential did have a peak in COVID, but that has come back to its long-term trend average. Now, focusing on the program, this was a program that was funded, as I said earlier, by state government and the City of Melbourne. And really the initial efforts were focused on trying to help businesses which were continuing to trade through the pandemic. What we did being engaged by the City of Melbourne was really look at the types of businesses that were still trading, those businesses which had closed, those businesses that had temporarily closed, and understanding what the gaps in that market were, what people were looking at, and the changed consumer patterns. So it's important that this is something that we are working with, not just in the CBD, but a range of different councils across Australia, is to actually understand what you have. So as I said, we're working with local governments from Sydney to Queensland, regional and metro. So it applies to all areas. But you also have to perform an analysis of what you have right now. Understand what traders, businesses are catering for your local demographic. We know that the commuting and working patterns have changed, but are they catering for that community? You then need to tailor a specific space strategy and also work with those stakeholders. So you've got agents, you've got landlords, you've got businesses, you've got local groups, creative industries that all want this space. So again, there's a lot of stakeholder engagement that has to be undertaken. What we did to ensure that whoever we put into this program complemented the types of businesses rather than competed. So we took a clustering approach and understood what the community was missing. And then we worked collaborative with the occupiers and the landlords and community to really see the program come to fruition. At the end of the program, we saw that the vacancy dropped from 35% to 15%. You can see that the activations were almost 40 activations at the end of 2 years. And that was reactivating vacant shop fronts that totaled more than 500 weeks of activation over that period of time, creating more than 100 jobs. And what we saw were different types of businesses, many businesses that were working from home or who had started from home, but didn't actually have a physical presence beforehand. So this program gave them an opportunity to test their concept, prove it, and actually what we're really pleased and proud of is that 40% of these occupiers that were supported through the program have actually extended and assigned a long-term lease, whether in the same premise or actually a new lease in a new premise. So we're seeing that these businesses are there in a post-COVID world. So it's just something that we need to reimagine and rethink how we use space. And I talk about space rather than retail, rather than office. We've heard about the growing need for health. That is certainly something that we're seeing coming into spaces now that previously weren't there. In terms of creating resilient precincts, and this is something that I've seen across Australia, I keep touching on the fact that COVID has had a structural change of the economy, how people live, work, and play. And as a result, there's going to be implications for all areas, not just CBDs or high streets, some good, some bad. But what we have seen, there's going to be a collaborative approach undertaken to find creative solutions and holistic solutions. This is something going to be everlasting, and we need to understand how these spaces, the demand has changed. And just because it was a cafe doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a cafe. Just because it was an office doesn't necessarily mean it could be an office. It could be requirement for a health provider now. So what we've seen, that there is an opportunity for different communities and local communities with a dispersed workforce now much more engaged in their local community rather than commuting 5 days a week, 9 to 5 to CBDs or business hubs. The other thing I want to touch on, and I know we haven't got long, but as I said, this is not just a Melbourne issue, albeit Melbourne did experience the greatest lockdown. It is something that we're seeing across the world. So if we look at the office occupancy rates, and this is compared to pre-COVID and to COVID, you can see while Melbourne lags most other capital cities of Australia, it's quite common in comparison to New York, Madrid, London, where their office occupancy rates compared to COVID is still sub 50%. So this change of work has actually occurred globally, not just in Melbourne where we had experienced the greatest lockdown, but what this represents is an opportunity for local communities to go, okay, we have a dispersed workforce, how can we engage that? And how does that economy improve now that you've got workers locally who, rather than commuting into CBD or other locations? Thank you, Bronwyn.
Thanks very much, Richard. And I love some of those terms you use there, thinking about space rather than retail or office buildings.